The sky rippled. At first, no one noticed. A few astronomers reported unusual distortions in the upper atmosphere, as if space itself were folding. But the anomalies didn't make headlines until the Veritas arrived. The news broke worldwide within minutes. Reports flooded in from every continent. An enormous geometric structure, resembling a twisting Mobius strip, had appeared in Earth's orbit. No radio signals, no standard attempts at communication. Just silent, motionless presence. Then, without warning, they spoke. Not through radio waves, not through sound, through every human mind simultaneously. We are the Veritas. We seek dialogue with your species. We speak only truth. We ask the same of you. Panic spread. Scientists scrambled for explanations. Governments convened emergency meetings. The world held its breath. Then, in the span of hours, the Veritas descended. Their arrival was unlike any first contact scenario humanity had imagined. No warships, no weaponry, just light, pale, silver luminescence forming towering figures that materialized in every major city at once. They appeared human-like, but only in the vaguest sense, tall, elongated, their faces smooth and absent of any deception. Their eyes were rings of shifting energy, as if staring into the very core of existence. One Veritas emissary appeared before the United Nations in New York, another before the European Parliament in Brussels, another in Beijing. They spoke at once, perfectly synchronized, their voices reverberating in the minds of every person in the vicinity. We have traversed the stars, seeking sentient beings who uphold truth. We have seen civilizations rise and fall by the strength or frailty of their honesty. Your species intrigues us. You have knowledge. You have progress. But you also harbor something dangerous, a corruption of truth. We must understand. The world, for the first time in history, stood still. For days, the Veritas studied human language, philosophy, science. They absorbed information with terrifying speed. They admired human logic, our ability to build vast systems of knowledge. But something disturbed them. They first noticed it in art. A scientist in Geneva explained the concept of poetry to a Veritas scholar, and the alien visibly recoiled. A historian in Tokyo recounted the myths of Japan's creation, and the Veritas emissary whispered, "Falsehood." It was a writer in London who made the mistake of showing them fiction. Dr. Marianne Lawton, a renowned literary scholar, had been selected to introduce the Veritas to human culture. She approached them with optimism, believing that stories were the bridge between civilizations. Standing before one of their emissaries, she read an excerpt from the Odyssey. When she finished, the Veritas was silent. Then it spoke. These events did not happen. Dr. Lawton hesitated. "No," she admitted. "It's a myth, a story, but it carries meaning beyond fact. It teaches us about heroism, perseverance. It is falsehood, a deception, a lie." A hush fell over the room. Dr. Lawton swallowed. "It's not meant to deceive. Stories are a way for humans to explore truth beyond facts. Truth is absolute," the Veritas intoned. "Your species corrupts it willingly." The meeting ended abruptly, but the damage had been done. The Veritas withdrew. Their emissaries vanished from public spaces. Their glowing structures darkened. Humanity's greatest tool, the ability to imagine, had become their greatest crime. Then, 3 days later, the first erasures began. At exactly midnight, every digital archive storing fictional works went blank. Millions of books, films, scripts, paintings depicting myths, all erased in an instant. People woke to find their bookshelves empty, their Kindles wiped clean. Every fictional story was gone. Libraries were hollowed out. Theater productions were abruptly halted as actors forgot their lines, not by mistake, but because the words had been removed from existence. Entire literary canons, Shakespeare, Austen, Tolkien, Orwell, vanished overnight. Panic set in. Scholars protested. Scientists demanded answers. But the Veritas had made their decision. Your species has indulged in deception for too long. We seek only to correct your course. Governments attempted negotiations, but the Veritas refused. "We do not punish," they claimed. "We cleanse." It was Mira Patel, a celebrated novelist, who first fought back. In a televised address, Mira spoke passionately. "They don't understand. They see fiction as lies, but stories are what make us human. They teach us who we are. If we let them erase our stories, we let them erase us." Her words ignited a resistance. Writers, filmmakers, artists, and dreamers of every kind realized the unthinkable. If they did nothing, imagination itself would die. The war against storytelling had begun. Mira Patel stood in the ruins of the New York Public Library, the smell of burning ink thick in the air. The great halls, once teeming with books, were eerily silent, the shelves emptied by a force beyond human comprehension. Pages drifted across the floor like fallen leaves, their words stripped away, leaving behind only blank parchment. It had happened overnight. Every physical book that contained fiction, novels, poems, myths, plays, had been rendered useless. Ink vanished from pages. Digital archives, libraries, and film databases were wiped clean. Even personal notes, private journals, unfinished manuscripts, all gone. The Veritas had been methodical, surgical in their eradication. The world woke to an absence. In London, bookshops stood with barren shelves, their owners staring in disbelief at the void where centuries of literature had been. In Los Angeles, filmmakers found entire scripts deleted, cameras refusing to replay recorded scenes. Museums reported that entire paintings depicting mythological themes had been erased, their canvases now blank. At first, people thought it was some kind of cyber attack, a mass data failure. Governments scrambled for explanations, issuing emergency broadcasts. But when the Veritas appeared on every screen in the world, their collective voice echoing into the minds of millions, the truth became undeniable. "We have removed the deception that has plagued your civilization. You are free now." The backlash was immediate. Protests erupted in major cities. Intellectuals, historians, and artists took to the streets, demanding the return of their stories. Scientists attempted to understand how the Veritas had altered reality itself, how physical books could be rewritten, how human memories seemed untouched but rendered useless without the records to reinforce them. But the Veritas did not respond. They did not explain. They merely continued. Television networks lost all scripted shows, their actors staring blankly into cameras, their dialogue erased. Theaters darkened. Even children's storybooks vanished, leaving parents struggling to explain bedtime without fairy tales. The loss was more than just intellectual. It was spiritual. For Mira, it was personal. She'd spent her life crafting stories, worlds spun from ink and imagination, characters that breathed and loved and suffered. Now, every novel she had ever written was blank. Her laptop contained nothing but empty documents. It felt as if a piece of her very soul had been amputated. She wasn't alone. Across the city, in a dimly lit bar that had once hosted poetry readings, the resistance was forming. Elijah Ward, an independent filmmaker whose life's work had been erased, stood at the head of a gathering of artists, writers, actors, and scholars. They were all shell-shocked, clutching blank pages and empty devices, their voices raw from shouting a universe that refused to listen. "They don't understand," Elijah growled, pacing. "They think fiction is deception. That's their mistake. They don't see that stories are truth wrapped in possibility." Mira, seated in the corner, barely recognized her own voice when she spoke. "They're not going to stop. They see storytelling as a disease, and they think they're curing us." A grim silence settled over the group. Then an older woman, a former professor of literature, spoke. "We need to fight back. We need to preserve what's left." Mira exhaled sharply. "How?" "Everything is gone." "Not everything," the professor countered. "Our minds still hold the stories. They haven't erased our memories, just the evidence." Elijah nodded slowly. "So we rewrite them." A murmur of agreement swept through the room. Mira felt something stir inside her, a spark, faint but growing. They had taken the words from the page, but not from the people. That night, the resistance began its work. They gathered in hidden places, basements, abandoned bookstores, underground performance spaces. They reconstructed stories from memory, whispering epics into the dark, scribbling down fragments of forgotten worlds. They began printing pamphlets, handwritten, photocopied, smuggled from place to place. But the Veritas were watching. It started with arrests. Writers and poets vanished from their homes, their apartments left undisturbed. The only clue to their fate, a lingering silence where once there had been words. Filmmakers attempting to record new scripts found their footage corrupted before they could even play it back. Then came the public purges. In Paris, a group of actors was arrested for staging a secret play in an abandoned cathedral. The Veritas declared them purveyors of deception. And when they were released, they were different, silent, empty-eyed, as if whatever fire had burned within them had been snuffed out. Mira watched the news in horror. The Veritas weren't just erasing fiction. They were breaking the storytellers. Fear spread. Writers went into hiding. The resistance became more cautious, whispering their work instead of writing it. But even in the face of destruction, they endured. Because something was happening, something the Veritas didn't anticipate. Humans fought back with memory. Grandparents recited fairy tales to their grandchildren in hushed voices. Poets spoke their verses in the safety of the underground. A community theater in Berlin performed Shakespeare from memory in secret, their lines unrecorded, existing only in the moment. The Veritas could erase the written word, but they couldn't stop the human voice. Mira knew this was the key. If they were to survive, they had to show the Veritas that stories were not lies, but truth in another form. And she had an idea, a dangerous one that could get her killed. But if it worked, it might just save storytelling itself. Mira Patel stared at the underground hideout, her fingers curled around a leather notebook, the only blank pages left that hadn't been wiped clean. She hesitated. The small basement smelled of dust and ink, a relic of a world that had once flourished with storytelling. Inside, the resistance whispered, their voices the last embers of an endangered fire. She had come to ignite it again. She pushed the door open. The gathering inside was small but fierce. Writers, poets, actors, painters, everyone who had something to lose in a world without stories. Everyone who had already lost something. At the center of the room stood Elijah Ward, arms crossed, jaw set in frustration. His dark eyes scanned a tattered script, the last script he had managed to print before the Veritas purge. It was blank now, just like every book, every film reel, every stage production wiped from history. He looked up. "Tell me you have a plan." Mira closed the door behind her. "Not just a plan," she said. "A weapon." The others leaned in. A woman with ink-stained fingers, Anya Rojas, an illustrator who had been reduced to drawing abstract shapes since the purge, arched a skeptical brow. "We've tried writing. We've tried memorizing. The Veritas know. They erase everything as soon as we create it. That's because we're recording," Mira said. She set the leather notebook on the table, flipping it open. The pages were pristine, untouched, but not for long. They erase words. They erase images, but they don't erase memories. What if we created something that couldn't be erased? A pause. Then Elijah exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "You mean spoken word?" "Yes," Mira said, excitement stirring. The Veritas can't erase something that isn't written. They can't erase something that only exists in human minds. Elijah frowned. "They already know we tell stories in secret. They still find ways to stop us." Mira nodded. "So we don't just tell stories. We make them hear them." A hush fell over the room. Anya's brow furrowed. "You're talking about them?" "Yes," Mira said. "The Veritas don't understand stories because they've never had to imagine. They exist only in absolute truth. They don't comprehend possibility." Elijah narrowed his eyes. "So we force them to listen." Myra's voice was barely above a whisper. "We make them feel it." The resistance began to move in secret. They knew one thing for certain. The Veritas could detect deception, but they had no concept of the meaning behind human storytelling. They viewed fiction as a disease, something to be purged. But Mira and the others believed that stories weren't lies. They were a different kind of truth. The challenge was simple. Could a Veritas experience a story without rejecting it? To test this, they would have to trap a Veritas in a story. And that meant performing a tale in front of them, in real time, with no written record. Only voices, only human minds holding the story together. The Veritas could erase words from a page, erase pixel from a screen, but they couldn't erase what was inside someone's head. That was their weakness. The resistance worked quickly. They spread through the city, whispering to those who still believed. Actors who had once graced Broadway, poets who had spoken words of power, musicians who played melodies that once told sagas. They gathered in secret, rehearsing their performance in basements and abandoned warehouses, making sure the tale would be unforgettable. It was a simple story, a hero who lost everything, a journey of suffering, a truth discovered not through facts, but through pain and dreams. It wasn't written down. It was passed from mouth to mouth, memorized, embedded in hearts. The Veritas would hear it, and they would have no choice but to feel it. The night of the trial, Mira and Elijah stood in the center of an abandoned theater. The seats were filled, not by humans, but by Veritas emissaries who had come to witness what the resistance called their demonstration. "We have agreed to hear you," one Veritas intoned. Their voices, always in unison, echoed in the air. "You claim that your deceptions hold truth. You claim fiction is not falsehood. Prove it." Mira took a deep breath. No script, no written words, only memory, only feeling. She began to speak. The story unfolded, not just in words, but in emotion. The performers moved, their voices weaving together a tale of love and loss, of war and sacrifice, of dreams and nightmares. For the first time, the Veritas did not interrupt. They did not declare falsehood. They listened, and something changed. One Veritas flinched. Another shifted in their seat. A ripple of something foreign passed through them. Emotion. The story reached its climax. The hero stood at the edge of despair, at the precipice of oblivion. The audience held its breath. Even the Veritas. For the first time, they were experiencing a truth that wasn't fact, but feeling. And then, as Mira uttered the final words, a single sound echoed through the silent room. A gasp. One of the Veritas, an emissary called Prime Arbiter Voss, had reacted. The trial ended. The Veritas left. But something was different. Because for the first time, they hadn't erased the story. The aftermath. Mira and Elijah watched from the rooftops as the Veritas returned to their floating city in the sky. They didn't erase it. Elijah whispered. "No," Mira murmured. They didn't. It was the first crack in their logic. The Veritas had spent their existence eradicating fiction, believing it to be a disease. But they had felt something in that performance. And now, they had a question they couldn't erase. If fiction was a lie, why did it feel true? The resistance had won a battle, but the war for storytelling had only begun. The Veritas did not respond immediately. For 3 days after the performance, their great Mobius-like structure remained motionless in Earth's orbit, silent, like a great celestial judge deliberating a verdict. For Mira, Elijah, and the resistance, those 3 days were both a victory and a warning. The Veritas had not erased the story they had performed. That alone was proof that something had changed. But what would happen next? The answer came at sunrise on the 4th day. A pulse of silver light descended from the sky, materializing in Times Square. The Veritas stood motionless, their towering figures glowing with an eerie, otherworldly energy. Pedestrians froze. A whisper of unease swept through the crowd as the aliens spoke, their voices vibrating not just in the air, but inside every human mind. "You have shown us something we do not understand. We do not know if this is wisdom or deception. A final judgment must be made." Their decree rippled across the world in an instant. A trial of truth would be held. Mira felt a chill settle in her bones when she heard the words. A trial? The Veritas did not conduct trials in the human sense. They did not argue or debate. To them, truth was absolute. Either something was real or it was false. No middle ground. And now, They were putting storytelling itself on trial. The trial was set to take place in Geneva, at the Paletta Nations, the former home of the United Nations. The Veritas chose the location, a symbol of human diplomacy, but the irony was clear. This was not a negotiation. They had no interest in politics. They sought an answer to a single question. Does storytelling corrupt truth, or does it reveal it? The world held its breath as the day arrived. Every major government sent delegates. Scientists, linguists, philosophers, and historians gathered, desperate to defend human culture. But the Veritas had already made one thing clear. This trial would not be decided by debate or reason alone. Truth had to be felt. And so, once again, it was up to the storytellers. Mira and Elijah were chosen to speak. Not because they were experts, not because they were powerful, but because they had been the first to make the Veritas listen. They had one chance, one final performance to prove that fiction was not a lie. The great hall of the Paletta Nations had never felt so cold. Hundreds of seats were filled with onlookers, human and alien alike. Large monitors broadcasted the event to every corner of the world. A single Veritas stood at the center of the room, towering above the human delegation. Prime Arbiter Voss, the being who had gasped at their last performance. The one Veritas who had felt something. Speak, Voss intoned, their voice ringing through the chamber. Show us what you believe to be truth. Mira's throat tightened. She and Elijah had prepared, but nothing could truly prepare them for this moment. Then, she stepped forward. Her voice was calm, steady. I want to tell you a story. We do not wish for deceptions. It isn't deception, Mira said. It's a memory. And then, she began. She told the story of her father, of a man who had fought in a war, who had suffered, who had lost everything, but who had carried on because he believed that there was something more than suffering. She described his hands, rough and scarred, as he built a small bookshelf for her when she was a child. A gift, she said, to hold stories that would teach her who she was. The room was silent. Then, Elijah took over. He painted a scene with words alone, a child standing at the edge of an ocean, dreaming of touching the stars. A child who grew up to be a scientist, who built the very telescopes that allowed humanity to glimpse the infinite. It never happened, he admitted. Not exactly. Not like this. He turned, looking directly at Prime Arbiter Voss. But does that mean it isn't true? A murmur rippled through the audience. The Veritas did not react immediately, but they were listening. Then Mira continued. She told of a world where there were no stories. A world where history existed, but without myths, without symbols, without dreams. A world of pure fact, she said softly. A world without the stories that make us who we are. She let the silence stretch. Then she asked, would you want to live in that world? For the first time, the Veritas did not answer. Voss, standing before them, lowered their gaze. The trial stretched into the night. Others came forward, historians, teachers, survivors of war who had held on to hope because of stories told in the darkness. The Veritas listened to them all. Then at last Voss spoke. We do not understand. The words were quieter than before, almost uncertain. We do not understand how something that is false can still reveal truth. They turned to Mira. But we will not erase what we do not understand. The next morning, the Veritas withdrew their purge. Not because they accepted storytelling, not because they fully understood, but because, for the first time, they questioned. Their laws dictated absolute truth, but what Mira and Elijah had shown them was a different kind of truth, one they could not measure, one they could not erase. For the first time in their long existence, the Veritas left something unfinished. They departed from Earth, their great ship vanishing into the void. But before they left, Prime Arbiter Voss left behind a single message, written in human language. Truth is not only what is, it is also what could be. The battle was over, and storytelling had won. The Veritas were gone. For the first time in months, the sky was clear of their presence, the Mobius-like structure no longer casting its eerie glow over Earth. Their departure had been as silent as their arrival. No speeches, no declarations. Just absence. Yet, they had left something behind. The message carved into stone at the Paletta Nations, in careful, deliberate script. Truth is not only what is, it is also what could be. It was not a victory in the way humanity had imagined. The Veritas had not admitted they were wrong. They had not apologized for the purge, but they had done something far greater. They had questioned, and for a species that had never doubted its own understanding of reality, that was the first crack in an unshakable foundation. Mira stood before the inscription, running her fingers over the smooth, carved letters. It had been weeks since the trial, but she still returned here often, as if expecting the words to vanish like everything else the Veritas had erased. Elijah approached from behind, his footsteps quiet. They really didn't take it back. They could have, Mira murmured, but they didn't. He crossed his arms. Do you think they'll ever come back? Mira exhaled. I think they're already different than when they first arrived. I think they'll spend centuries trying to understand what happened here. Elijah chuckled. We broke their brains with bedtime stories. Mira smiled, but there was sadness in it. We showed them something they couldn't erase. That was enough. But was it? The world was still reeling from what had been lost. The Veritas had undone their purge, but they hadn't restored the stories they had erased. Millions of books remained blank. Digital archives, scripts, paintings, films, all gone. Only what humans had remembered survived. Libraries remained filled with empty pages. Bookshelves stood like mausoleums of forgotten tales. Museums displayed paintings stripped of their myths, canvases once alive with gods and monsters now bare and silent. The world felt quieter, but not for long, because humanity is not a species that lets silence linger. The movement began as a whisper. Writers gathered in empty libraries, filling notebooks by hand, rewriting what had been lost. Historians worked tirelessly to reconstruct myths from memory, while actors staged plays with no scripts, passing stories down the way their ancestors once had, by word of mouth, by heart. The world had been given a second chance, and it refused to let it slip away. Elijah returned to filmmaking, but this time there were no scripts, just stories spoken and remembered, improvised and alive. His first project after the purge was a film called The Words That Stayed, a simple, powerful story about a girl who fights to remember a book that has been erased. It was the first film made in a world after the Veritas, and it was just the beginning. Artists, poets, musicians, they all fought back in the only way they knew how, by creating. It was slow at first. Some works would never be recovered. Some stories were gone forever. But humanity had never been built on what was lost. It had always been built on what came next. Months passed. The world moved forward. And then, one night, the sky rippled. Mira had been writing, longhand, as she had learned to do since the purge. But when she stepped outside, she saw the same kind of distortion that had preceded the Veritas arrival. For a single moment, fear gripped her. Had they returned? But the Veritas did not descend. No ships appeared. Instead, a pulse of light streaked across the sky, brief, brilliant. And then, in every major city, the same message appeared. It was not written in Veritas symbols. It was not broadcast into human minds. It was written in human languages: English, Chinese, Arabic, Spanish, Hindi, Russian, etched in light across the clouds. And it was only 5 words. Tell us another story, Earth. Mira felt her breath hitch. She didn't know if they were listening from the depths of space, or if the message was automated, or if the Veritas themselves had finally begun to change. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the question. The Veritas had come to Earth believing that stories were lies. And now they were asking for one. Mira turned to Elijah, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't have all the answers. She didn't know what the future held. But she knew this. The greatest truth humanity had ever known was never found in numbers, in facts, in logic alone. It was found in the spaces between, in the myths, in the fictions, in the impossible dreams that had led them to the stars. She smiled, and she picked up her pen, because humanity had always been storytellers. And now, even the stars were listening.